horse reared so hard that Gerard almost lost the reins, and for one heartbeat he thought he had killed her. She stood in the middle of the drive as though the storm did not touch her, rain running down her face, her dark dress soaked through and clinging to her shoulders, and she did not move, even when the animal's hooves came down inches from where she stood. Gerard hauled back with all his strength, his own heart slamming against his ribs, and the horse finally skidded to a halt on the wet gravel, throwing mud across the hem of her skirt. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The rain fell between them like a curtain, and lightning cracked somewhere over the hills, lighting up the crumbling towers of Renwick Hall behind her. "Are you mad?" Gerard said, his voice rough with the fright she had given him. "I could have run you down." "You did not," she said simply, as if that settled the matter. He swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking into the mud, and studied her properly for the first time. She was younger than he had first thought, with a plain, striking face and eyes that held steady on his without any of the deference he was used to from strangers who learned his title. She did not curtsy. She did not apologize. She only reached into the folds of her sodden cloak and drew out something small and dark, holding it toward him with a hand that did not shake despite the cold. It was a key, old iron, heavy, the kind that belonged to a door built 100 years before either of them was born. "What is this?" Gerard asked, not taking it. "The key to the West Tower," she said. "The one your steward told you was lost. It is not lost. It has been in my keeping for 6 years. Gerard felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the rain. He had been back at Renwick less than an hour, riding ahead of his own carriage because he could not bear to sit still one more mile, and already a stranger on his own drive was speaking of things he did not understand, in a tone that suggested she understood a great deal. "I do not know you," he said. "No," she agreed. "But I know you, Your Grace. I have been waiting a long time for you to come home." She pressed the key into his hand before he could refuse it, her fingers briefly cold against his palm, and then she reached into her cloak again and drew out a folded letter, the paper gone soft and thin from handling. She held it out the same way, steady, unhurried, as though the storm raging around them was nothing at all. "Read this when you are alone," she said. "Not before, not with anyone else in the room, especially not Mr. Colbert." The name struck him oddly. Edwin Colbert was his steward, the man who had managed Renwick in his absence, the man whose letters over the past 3 years had grown steadily shorter and vaguer about the state of the accounts. Gerard opened his mouth to ask how this woman, soaked to the skin and standing alone on a public drive in the middle of a storm, knew anything of his steward at all. But when he looked up from the letter in his hand, she was already walking away, moving quickly toward the tree line at the edge of the park, her skirts dragging heavy and dark behind her. "Wait," he called. "What is your name?" She did not turn around. Within moments the rain and the dark had swallowed her whole, and Gerard stood alone on the drive with a strange key in one hand and a stranger's letter in the other, his horse blowing hard beside him, the towers of his own house rising black and silent against the storm. For a moment he considered following her into the trees, but the storm was worsening, and his horse was already skittish from the fright of nearly trampling her, so instead he stood there in the mud, turning the key over in his fingers, feeling the weight of it settle into something more than metal. 6 years, she had said. 6 years of keeping a key safe, and a letter, and whatever else her father had left behind, waiting for a duke who had spent those same years half a world away, telling himself that Renwick could manage without him a little longer. He had left after his father's funeral with barely a word to anyone, unable to bear the empty rooms and the weight of a title he had never wanted so young. He had told himself the estate was in good hands, that Colbert's letters, however thin, meant the harvests were steady and the tenants content. He had told himself a great many things, he realized now, standing in the rain with a stranger's key in his hand, and none of them had been particularly true. He rode the rest of the way to the house in a kind of daze, the letter tucked inside his coat where the rain could not reach it, and by the time the great doors of Renwick Hall opened to receive him, he had almost convinced himself he had imagined the whole encounter. Almost. The hall that greeted him told its own story, and it was not a happy one. Dust lay thick on the surfaces that should have gleamed. Several of the wall sconces stood dark, their candles never replaced. A housekeeper he barely recognized, a thin, nervous woman named Mrs. Whitfield, wrung her hands as she welcomed him home, apologizing for the state of things in a voice that suggested she had been dreading this moment for months. "We were not certain of the exact day you would arrive, Your Grace," she said, hurrying ahead of him down a corridor that smelled faintly of damp. "Mr. Colbert manages the household accounts now, you understand, and he did not think it necessary to open the east rooms until spring. "The east rooms have always been opened," Gerard said. "My mother's rooms." Mrs. Whitfield's mouth pressed into a thin line, and she said nothing further, which told Gerard more than any explanation could have. He walked the length of the great hall before going up, running his hand along the banister and finding it gritty with dust, noting the pale squares on the walls where paintings had once hung and now did not. He remembered this house full of light and voices, his mother's laughter carrying down from the music room, his father's dog sprawled before the fire in the front parlor. What he found instead was silence, and cold, and the particular hush of a house that had been slowly emptied of everything that once made it feel alive. He said nothing of this to Mrs. Whitfield, but he noted it, the way he noted everything now, filing it away beside the strange encounter on the drive, and the key resting heavy in his coat pocket. He found Colbert waiting for him in the study, a well-fed man with an easy smile and a handshake that lasted a fraction too long, full of warm words about how glad the whole estate was to see its duke returned at last. Gerard listened to the man's account of the past 3 years with growing unease, a feeling he could not quite name settling low in his stomach. Every question he asked was answered smoothly, every figure explained away with talk of bad harvests and difficult tenants and repairs that had, regrettably, proven more costly than expected. It was only when Colbert mentioned, in passing, that the West Tower had been sealed for years because the old key had been lost in a fire, that Gerard felt the letter in his coat grow suddenly heavy. He said nothing. He only nodded and asked to be shown to his rooms, pleading the fatigue of the road, and Colbert bowed himself out with every appearance of satisfaction. Alone at last, with the door locked and the fire lit against the chill of the storm outside, Gerard drew out the letter and broke the seal. The handwriting inside was neat and careful, clearly written by someone who had taken great pains over every word. It began with no greeting at all. "Your Grace, if you are reading this, then I am no longer able to tell you these things myself, and my daughter has judged the moment right to place this letter in your hands. I served your father as land agent for 11 years, and in that service I discovered things about the management of this estate that I believe he never knew, and that I fear his successor has continued and worsened. I did not have the standing to accuse a man like Edwin Colbert while I lived. I hope you will have the courage to do what I could not." The letter went on for 2 more pages, dense with dates and figures, references to ledgers and rents and sums that did not add up, all of it pointing toward a slow, careful theft that had been bleeding Renwick dry for years, dressed up in explanations about bad harvests and difficult tenants. Gerard read it twice, then a third time, his fire burning low and the storm still rattling the windows, and when he finally set it down his hands were not quite steady. He thought of the woman on the drive, soaked through and unafraid, standing in his path as though she had been waiting there for years. He thought of her eyes, steady and unflinching, and the way she had said his title as though it meant nothing to her at all beyond the responsibility it carried. The letter was signed simply, Walter Hale, and beneath the signature, in the same careful hand, one final line had been added, as though after some hesitation. "My daughter's name is Mary Ann. She has kept these papers safe longer than any man should have asked of her. Do not let her courage go to waste." Gerard sat by the dying fire for a long time after that, the iron key resting heavy in his palm, and understood, with a certainty that startled him, that his quiet homecoming had just become something else entirely. Outside, the storm showed no sign of breaking, and somewhere beyond the tree line, in a cottage he did not yet know the location of, a woman who had waited 6 years for this night was, he suspected, not sleeping either. He rose at last and crossed to the window, looking out at the dark shape of the West Tower against the stormy sky, its windows blind and sealed, holding whatever secrets Walter Hale had died trying to protect. Tomorrow, he decided, he would find Mary Ann Hale. Tomorrow, he would open that tower himself, whatever it cost him, and whatever it revealed about the man he had trusted to keep his home safe in his absence. Tonight, he only sat with the key in his hand, and the rain against the glass, and let himself feel, for the first time in years, that he had come home to something that mattered. He thought of his father, gone 3 years now, and wondered how much of this the old man had known, or guessed, before the end. He thought of the empty rooms downstairs, the dust on the banister, the pale squares on the walls where paintings used to hang, and understood that all of it was connected, that a house did not fall into ruin by accident. Someone had let it happen, or worse, had made it happen, quietly, patiently, over years, while the rightful duke was too far away and too unwilling to look closely enough to notice. That would end now, he told himself, closing his hand around the key until the metal bit into his palm. Whatever it cost him, whatever it revealed, he would not sleep easy in this house again, until he understood exactly what had been taken from it, and from the woman who had risked everything to bring the truth to his door. The village of Renwick woke to a sky washed clean by the storm, and Gerard rode into it before the church bell had finished striking 8, ignoring the surprised looks of shopkeepers who had not expected to see their duke abroad so early. Dressed plainly, without a servant in sight. He found her at the edge of the village, in a small cottage set back from the road behind a low stone wall, kneeling in a patch of garden with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, pulling weeds from among a row of herbs with the same steady concentration she had shown standing in the rain the night before. She did not look up until his shadow fell across the soil in front of her, and even then she took her time, finishing the row before she rose and brushed the dirt from her hands. "Your Grace," she said, with a small, cool nod that held nothing of an apology for last night's strange behavior. "Marianne Hale," Gerard said, "I read your father's letter." Something moved behind her eyes then, quick and guarded, gone almost before he could name it. "I hoped you would." "Sit with me," he said, "or walk with me. I do not much care which. But I want the whole of it, not scattered across a few pages written by a dying man trying to say everything at once." She studied him for a long moment, as though weighing whether he deserved the truth after all, and then she untied her apron, hung it on the garden gate, and gestured toward the path that led along the stream at the edge of the village. They walked in silence for a while, the morning air still cool and damp from the storm, before she began to speak, and once she started the words came steadily, as though she had rehearsed this telling many times in her mind and only ever lacked someone willing to listen. Her father, Walter Hale, had served as land agent to the Ashworth family for 11 years, first under Gerard's father and then, briefly, at the very start of Colbert's tenure as steward, before illness forced him to retire from active duty. In those final months, confined largely to his cottage, Walter had continued to receive reports from tenants who trusted him more than they trusted the new steward, and what he heard troubled him deeply. Rents collected but not recorded. Repairs billed to the estate that were never carried out. Timber sold from the western woods without any accounting of where the money had gone. "He tried to raise it with your father," Marianne said, her voice steady but her hands twisting slightly at her sides. "But your father was already unwell by then, and Mr. Colbert was very good at making concerns sound like the confusion of an old man losing his grip on details. My father was dismissed from his position within the year, officially for reasons of health. He always believed it was because he asked too many questions. And after he was dismissed, he kept records anyway, quietly. Tenants would tell him things and he wrote them down, dates and figures, whatever he could gather without drawing attention to himself. He believed that one day, someone would need proof, even if he did not live to see it used." Gerard felt the cold, familiar unease from the night before settling deeper into his chest. Why did he not send this to me directly? I would have listened. "Would you?" Marianne stopped walking and turned to face him fully for the first time, and there was no softness in her expression now, only a hard, tired honesty. "You were on the other side of the world, Your Grace, managing your family's interests in places that were not this one. My father wrote to you twice. He told me himself. He never received a reply." The words landed like a blow, because Gerard could not deny them. He remembered vaguely, now that she said it, letters that had arrived at his lodgings abroad, letters he had set aside unread during a season when he could not bear to think of Renwick at all, when every reminder of home had felt like reopening a wound he was not ready to face. He had told himself there would be time enough later to attend to such things. He had been wrong. "I am sorry," he said, and meant it more than he had meant anything in a long while. They resumed walking, slower now, and Marianne told him more of her father, the way his hands had begun to shake in his final year, the way he had insisted on writing every entry himself despite the pain it caused him, refusing to trust the task to her handwriting, in case anyone later questioned whether the records were genuine. She described nights spent by the fire while he dictated figures to her from memory, cross-checking them against scraps of paper tenants had pressed into his hand at market, a farmer's rent receipt here, a note about timber wagons passing through at odd hours there, each piece small and unremarkable on its own, but together forming a pattern too consistent to be accident. He was afraid, toward the end, that he would die before anyone came to hold Mr. Colbert to account, she said. He used to say that a thief who is never caught simply becomes a respectable man, and that Renwick would slowly starve, while everyone called it bad luck and poor harvests. Gerard said nothing for a while, turning that thought over. He remembered Colbert's easy smile the night before, his talk of difficult tenants and unfortunate weather, and felt something harden in him that had not been there when he first rode up the drive. Marianne's expression did not soften, not entirely, but something in her shoulders eased slightly, as though she had expected denial and received honesty instead, and had not quite known what to do with it. "My father died 18 months ago," she said. "He made me promise to keep the papers safe and wait for you to come home yourself, in person, before I acted. He said a letter alone would be too easy to dismiss or destroy. He wanted you to see it, and to see me, and to have no way of pretending the matter was not real." "The key," Gerard said. "The West Tower. There is a strong room behind the old library shelves, built by your grandfather, that Mr. Colbert does not know exists. My father used it to store the estate's original account books, the ones kept before Colbert took over, so they could not conveniently disappear the way so many other papers have over the years. The key I gave you unlocks the tower stair. From there you will need to look for a second door, hidden behind the shelving on the north wall." Gerard stared at her, turning the pieces over in his mind, and found himself struck less by suspicion than by a reluctant, growing admiration for the careful, patient way she had guarded this secret. "You have carried this alone for a year and a half. 6 years, if you count the time before he died, when I helped him gather what he could," she said simply. "I was not always going to be believed on my own, a woman, and a steward's daughter besides, making accusations against a respected man of business. I needed the Duke himself to see it and decide what to do." They had reached a bend in the stream where the water ran fast and shallow over flat stones, and Gerard stopped there, watching the current for a moment before he spoke again. "Then let us go and open that tower together, today, now, before Colbert has any more time to prepare an explanation for whatever we find." Something flickered across her face that might almost have been relief, quickly suppressed. "He will already be suspicious," she warned. "You asked him about the tower last night. Men like Colbert do not survive years of quiet theft by being careless. If he suspects you have doubts, he will move quickly to protect himself." "Then we move quicker," Gerard said. They walked back toward the hall together, and as the great gray towers came into view above the trees, Gerard found himself glancing at her more than once, struck by how little she resembled the timid, grateful dependents he had half expected to find populating his diminished household. She walked with her chin level and her eyes forward, matching his stride without apparent effort, and when their eyes met once, briefly, over some remark about the state of the eastern hedgerows, he felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with account books or missing timber at all. He pushed the feeling aside as unhelpful and dangerous, given everything else at stake, but it did not entirely leave him. At the edge of the park, before the house came fully into view, Marianne stopped him with a hand briefly on his sleeve. "There is one more thing you should know before we go in," she said. "Mr. Colbert believes my father died with nothing. He believes whatever proof existed died with him. If he learns that I have been the one keeping it safe all this time, and that I have now given it to you, he will not simply accept defeat quietly. A man who has stolen this much, for this long, has a great deal to lose." "Are you afraid of him?" "I am careful of him," she said, which was not quite the same answer, and Gerard noted the difference. "You should be too, Your Grace. He has spent years making himself indispensable to this estate. Removing him will not be as simple as producing a few old ledgers and expecting him to walk away." Gerard looked toward the house, its towers pale against the washed morning sky, and thought of the empty rooms, the dust on the banister, the letters from a dying man that had gone unanswered for want of his own courage to face what home might have become without him watching over it. "Simple or not," he said, "it will be done. I owe your father that much." "I owe you that much, for carrying this so long alone." Marianne held his gaze a moment longer, some careful calculation working behind her eyes, and then she nodded once, sharp and decided, and together they turned up the drive toward the house. They had not gone 20 paces before Gerard noticed a figure standing at one of the upper windows, watching their approach. Even at that distance there was no mistaking the solid, well-fed shape of Edwin Colbert, and though the man raised a hand in a pleasant, ordinary greeting the moment he saw Gerard look up, there was something in the stillness of him before that gesture, some fraction of a second where he had simply watched, that told Gerard the steward had been standing at that window for some time. "He saw us walking together," Marianne murmured, not breaking her stride, though her voice had dropped low. "That alone will trouble him. He knows who I am. He has always been careful around me, careful in a way that never quite matched how little regard he claims to have for a steward's daughter." "Then let him be troubled," Gerard said. "I find I no longer much care what Mr. Colbert thinks of my choices in my own house." Inside, Colbert met them in the entrance hall with his usual warmth. remarking pleasantly on the fine morning after such a storm, asking after Gerard's rest, offering to review the estate accounts together whenever it suited his Grace's convenience, all delivered with the easy confidence of a man who believed himself entirely secure. His eyes moved once, briefly, to Marianne, taking in her plain dress and the dirt still faintly visible at the hem where she had knelt in the garden, and something flickered behind his polite smile, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "Miss Hale," he said, "I did not expect to see you at the hall this morning." "I had business with His Grace," Marianne said evenly, offering nothing further, and Gerard found himself admiring the flat, unreadable calm with which she held the steward's gaze, giving him nothing to seize upon. Colbert's smile did not waver, but Gerard, watching closely now in a way he had not thought to the night before, noticed the faint tightening at the corners of the man's eyes, the way his fingers curled slightly at his sides before he mastered the impulse and let his hands hang loose and relaxed once more. It was a small thing, easily missed by anyone not already looking for it, but Gerard had spent enough years abroad negotiating with men who smiled while they lied to recognize the signs when he saw them now, close to home, in a man he had trusted without question only a day before. "I shall be occupied for much of the day," Gerard said, keeping his own tone light and unremarkable. "Family papers to sort through. You need not trouble yourself on my account, Mr. Colbert. I will send for you if anything requires your attention." "Of course, Your Grace," Colbert said, bowing slightly, though his eyes lingered on Marianne a moment longer before he turned and made his way toward the estate office, his footsteps unhurried, deliberately so, Gerard thought, as though the man wished to appear entirely undisturbed by anything he had just witnessed. Once he had gone, Marianne let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since they crossed the threshold. "He will move quickly now," she said quietly. "You should not wait until evening to open the tower. Every hour we delay is an hour he has to prepare himself, or worse, to reach the strong room first if he has ever suspected it exists." Gerard glanced toward the corridor where Colbert had disappeared, then back to her, and felt the last of his earlier hesitation fall away entirely. Whatever comfortable ignorance he had carried up the drive the night before was gone now, burned away by daylight and by the steady, unflinching account she had given him beside the stream. "Then we do not wait," he said. "Come, show me where my grandfather hid his stare." Marianne nodded, and for the first time since he had met her, standing soaked and unyielding in the storm, something that might almost have been the beginning of trust passed between them, quiet and unspoken, as they turned together toward the shadowed corridor that led to the west tower. The hinges screamed when Gerard finally forced the tower door open, a sound so sudden in the silence of the old stairwell that Marianne flinched and caught his arm without thinking, her fingers tight around his sleeve before she seemed to remember herself and let go. "Forgive me," she said, stepping back. "There is nothing to forgive," Gerard said, and found that he meant it more than the words strictly required. The stair beyond was narrow and dark, lit only by a shaft of gray light falling from a slit window somewhere far above, and the air smelled of dust and cold stone, undisturbed for years. Gerard went first, one hand trailing the wall to steady himself, the iron key still warm from his pocket, and Marianne followed close behind, holding her skirts clear of the crumbling steps. They climbed for what felt like a long time, past landings choked with broken furniture and rolled carpets left to rot, before the stair opened into what had once been the old library, a circular room lined floor to ceiling with shelves, most of them empty now, their books long since removed or lost to damp. Marianne crossed the room without hesitation, straight to the north wall, and pressed her palm flat against a section of paneling that looked, to Gerard's eye, exactly like every other section around it. "My father found this by accident," she said, "when he was still land agent, looking for an old survey map he believed your grandfather had stored up here. There is a catch, low, near the base, disguised as a knot in the wood." She knelt and felt along the panel until something gave with a soft click, and a narrow section of shelving swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a small chamber beyond, no larger than a closet, lined with shelves that held rows of leather-bound ledgers, their spines cracked with age but their pages, when Gerard lifted the nearest and opened it, still perfectly legible. "These are the original account books," Marianne said, "kept before Mr. Colbert took over the stewardship. My father moved them here himself, one at a time, over the course of a single winter, so no one would notice them missing from the estate office all at once." Gerard turned the pages slowly, his eyes catching on entries in a hand he recognized now as belonging to men long dead, careful columns of figures for rents and repairs and timber sales, everything accounted for down to the shilling. He found the final volume, the one covering the years just before Colbert's appointment, and beside it, tucked between the pages, a second, thinner book, bound in plain cloth, unlabeled. He opened it and found Walter Hale's handwriting, shakier than the entries in the earlier ledgers but unmistakably careful. Page after page of dates and figures that did not match the accounts Colbert had presented to Gerard only the night before. Rents collected that never appeared in the official books. Timber sold from the western woods at prices far below what the wood would have fetched at market, with no record of where the difference had gone. Repairs billed twice over, once to the estate, and once, it seemed, to a fund that existed nowhere except in Colbert's own private ledger. "This is enough," Gerard said quietly, his voice tight with something between anger and relief. "This is more than enough." Before they left the hidden chamber, Gerard insisted on climbing the last flight of the tower stair to see the room the key had originally been meant to open, curious despite himself about what else his grandfather might have concealed within these walls. The final door was warped with age and resisted his shoulder twice before it gave way, opening onto a round chamber with a floor of old oak boards, several of them visibly rotten near the far wall, where rain had clearly been finding its way in for years, through a gap in the roof slates. "Mind your step," Marianne said, catching his sleeve as he moved forward without thinking. "My father always said this floor was not to be trusted. He would never let me come up here alone." Gerard tested the boards carefully, working his way along the wall rather than the center of the room, and it was fortunate that he did, for a moment later, when he shifted his weight onto a board that looked no different from any other, it gave beneath him with a sharp crack, and only Marianne's quick grip on his arm, hauling him sideways with a strength that startled them both, kept him from dropping through into the darkness below. They stood afterward in silence, breathing hard, Gerard's heart still pounding from the sudden lurch of the floor beneath him, and it was only then that he noticed how close they stood, her hand still fisted in the fabric of his coat, her face pale with the fright of what had nearly happened. "That is twice now you have kept me from harm," he said, when he trusted his voice again. "First the horse, and now this." "I would rather not make a habit of it," she said, though the corner of her mouth twitched despite herself, and something in the tension of the moment eased into something gentler, unspoken, before either of them could examine it too closely. They retreated from the upper chamber and returned to the hidden room below, where the true business of the day still waited, and Gerard found himself more careful with his footing after that, and more aware, too, of the woman working quietly beside him. "There is more," Marianne said. She reached past him to a shelf near the back of the chamber and drew down a small strongbox, tarnished with age, and set it on the floor between them. "My father kept the physical proof here as well, receipts. A few letters Mr. Colbert was careless enough to send him early on, before he understood my father would not be bought." Gerard knelt and opened the box, and found exactly what she described, brittle papers that confirmed everything the ledgers suggested, including one letter in Colbert's own hand, dated some 7 years earlier, offering Walter Hale a share of certain unspecified proceeds in exchange for his silence regarding the timber accounts. Walter had never accepted. The letter had simply been kept, preserved, waiting for a moment exactly like this one. For a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of what they had found settling over the small, dusty chamber like something almost physical. Gerard looked up at last and found Marianne watching him, her expression carefully guarded but her eyes bright with something that might have been vindication, or exhaustion, or both at once. 6 years of quiet, lonely vigilance finally coming to rest. "Your father was a brave man," Gerard said, "and a careful one. Renwick owes him more than I know how to repay." "He would have said he only did his duty," Marianne said, her voice unsteady for the first time since Gerard had met her. "But thank you. No one has said his name with respect in a long while. Most of the village believes he left his post in disgrace." "That will change," Gerard said. "I intend to see that it changes very publicly, and very soon." They spent another hour in the hidden chamber, sorting the most essential papers into a leather satchel Marianne had thought to bring, leaving the bulk of the ledgers locked safely away for later retrieval. And by the time they descended the tower stair again, the light outside had shifted toward afternoon, gray clouds gathering once more over the park. It was on the final landing, where the stair opened onto the corridor leading back toward the main house, that they heard footsteps below, and Gerard caught Marianne's arm and drew her back into the shadow of an alcove without thinking, both of them going still as the footsteps grew closer. It was only a housemaid, carrying linens, who passed without glancing their way, but the moment left them standing closer together than either had quite intended, Marianne's shoulder against his chest, his hand still lightly curled around her arm, and when the maid's footsteps faded and they finally stepped apart, neither seemed entirely certain what to say. We should go carefully from here, Marianne said, smoothing her skirts, her voice a shade too brisk. If Mr. Colbert learns what we have found before you are ready to confront him, he will not simply wait to be accused. I know, Gerard said, though his mind was only half on the danger she described. On their way down through the main house, they passed two housemaids speaking in low, hurried voices near the linen room, who fell abruptly silent and dropped into curtsies the moment they noticed Gerard approaching. He caught only a fragment of what they had been saying before the silence fell, something about wages promised weeks ago and still unpaid, and a third maid, younger than the other two, who had left service entirely rather than continue waiting. Is that common? Gerard asked quietly, once they were out of earshot. Wages going unpaid? Marianne's expression tightened. More common than you would like to know. Mr. Colbert always has an explanation. A delay from the bank in the county town. A miscalculation that will be corrected next quarter. The staff have learned not to press the matter, for fear of losing their positions entirely. Gerard said nothing for a moment, turning this new piece of the pattern over alongside everything else. The empty rooms and the dust and the sealed east wing, all of it fitting together now into a shape he could no longer pretend not to see. He had returned to Renwick expecting neglect born of absence, the ordinary decline of a great house left too long without its master's eye. What he was uncovering instead was something far more deliberate, a slow and careful draining of everything the estate produced, dressed up convincingly enough that even the household staff, who lived with its consequences daily, had learned to accept it as simply the way things were. They made their way back to his study by a servant's passage Marianne knew well from years of visiting her father in his old office. And once the door was locked behind them, Gerard spread the papers across his desk and began, methodically, to build the case against his own steward, cross-referencing Colbert's official accounts against the hidden ledgers. Marianne beside him the whole while, her memory for figures sharp enough that she caught two discrepancies Gerard had missed entirely on his own. It was well into the evening, the fire burned low and both of them hollow-eyed with concentration, when a sharp knock at the study door made them both freeze. Gerard swept the most damning papers beneath a stack of ordinary correspondence before calling for whoever it was to enter, and was not entirely surprised when Colbert himself stepped into the room, his easy smile firmly in place, though his gaze flicked once, quickly, toward the desk before returning to Gerard's face. I did not wish to disturb you, Your Grace, but I understand you have been shut away all day with Miss Hale, Colbert said, his tone light, almost teasing, though there was something watchful beneath it that Gerard did not miss. I only wish to remind you that the quarterly accounts are due for your review by week's end, should you require my assistance in preparing them. Thank you, Mr. Colbert, Gerard said, matching the man's easy tone with an effort. I will send for you when I am ready. Colbert's eyes lingered on Marianne a moment longer than courtesy required, and something passed across his face, quick and calculating, before he inclined his head and withdrew, closing the door softly behind him. He knows something is different, Marianne said quietly once his footsteps had faded down the corridor. I could see it in his face. He is trying to determine how much we have found, and how quickly he needs to act. Gerard looked at the closed door for a long moment, then back to the papers spread across his desk, the careful, damning record of years of quiet theft laid bare at last, and felt the full weight of what still lay ahead of them. Then we finish this as quickly as we can, he said, for your father's sake, and for the sake of everyone at Renwick who has suffered under this man's management, without knowing why their lives had grown so much harder these past years. Marianne nodded, though her expression remained troubled, and when Gerard glanced at her, he saw not fear exactly, but the particular wariness of someone who had learned, through hard experience, that a cornered man was often more dangerous than one who believed himself entirely safe. There is something else you should know, she said slowly, as though deciding, finally, to trust him with it. 2 months before my father died, someone broke into our cottage while I was at market. Nothing was taken, except a small box of papers he kept beside his bed, papers he always said were less important than the ones hidden here. I always believed Mr. Colbert sent someone to search for exactly what we found today, and that he has spent every year since wondering whether he succeeded in destroying all of it, or whether something still remained. Gerard felt a cold, protective anger rise in him at that, sharper than anything the account books alone had stirred. Did you ever tell anyone? Who would have believed me? She said simply. A frightened woman, alone, claiming a respected steward had sent thieves to her door. I told no one. I only became more careful. Gerard crossed the room and, without entirely deciding to do so, took her hand in both of his, an unfamiliar gesture between them, but one that felt, in that moment, entirely necessary. You will not be alone in this any longer, he said. Whatever comes next, I intend to see this through beside you, and I intend to make certain Edwin Colbert answers for every single thing he has done, to this estate and to your family both. Marianne looked down at their joined hands, then up at him, something uncertain and unguarded moving across her face for the first time since he had met her on the storm-soaked drive the night before. Then let us finish it, she said, together. Outside, the evening had settled fully into dark, and somewhere below them, in the estate office, a lamp still burned late into the night, its light spilling faintly onto the gravel drive where Edwin Colbert sat alone, turning over in his mind exactly how much his Duke and the land agent's daughter had discovered, and exactly what he intended to do about it before either of them could act. In the study above, Gerard finally set down his pen and rubbed his eyes, aware for the first time in hours of how late it had grown. The candles burned nearly to their sockets, and the fire reduced to a bed of quiet embers. Marianne sat across from him, her own eyes heavy with fatigue, though she had not once suggested stopping before the work was done. You should return to the village before it grows any later, Gerard said, though he found he was reluctant to say it. I do not like the thought of you walking that road alone in the dark, not with everything we now suspect Mr. Colbert capable of. I have walked that road alone every night for 6 years, Marianne said, though her voice had softened, some of its earlier guardedness worn away by the long hours they had spent bent together over the same papers, the same careful, damning arithmetic of theft laid bare between them. But I will not refuse an escort tonight, if you are offering one. Gerard called for his horse to be brought round, and walked with her as far as the edge of the park, the two of them saying little, both worn through with the weight of what the day had uncovered, yet neither quite willing to part ways in silence entirely. At the gate, she paused and looked back toward the house, its towers dark against the night sky, except for the single lit window of the estate office below. He is still awake, she observed. So am I, Gerard said. So it seems, are you. A faint, tired smile touched her mouth then, the first he had seen from her since the storm the night before, and for a moment, the exhaustion and danger of the day fell away entirely, leaving only two people standing at a garden gate in the dark, closer to understanding one another than either had expected to be so soon. Good night, Your Grace, she said finally, stepping back toward the village road. Gerard, he said, before he could stop himself. You may call me Gerard, if you wish. After everything you have carried these 6 years, I think you have earned that much at least. She studied him a moment in the moonlight, something unreadable moving behind her eyes, and then she nodded once, slowly. Good night, Gerard, she said, testing the name carefully, as though it were a door she was not yet certain she should open, and then she turned and walked the familiar road toward home, leaving him standing alone at the gate, watching until the dark swallowed her from view, and feeling, for reasons he did not entirely wish to examine that night, considerably less alone himself than he had felt in a very long time. The summons arrived at the cottage before Marianne had even finished her morning tea, carried by a red-faced boy from the village who said only that Squire Bellamy required her presence at the magistrate's house by noon, on a matter concerning her late father's conduct as land agent. She read the note twice, her hands gone suddenly cold despite the cup still warm between them, and understood at once what had happened. Colbert had moved first. By the time she reached the magistrate's house, walking quickly through streets that seemed to watch her pass with new and unwelcome interest, she found Gerard already there, his face tight with barely controlled anger, standing apart from a small gathering that included Colbert himself, composed and solemn, and Squire Bellamy, an elderly man with tired eyes who looked deeply unhappy to be presiding over the matter at all. Miss Hale, Bellamy said, not unkindly, once she had been shown in. Mr. Colbert has brought certain documents to my attention. Documents he claims prove your late father engaged in irregular dealings during his time as land agent, including the diversion of estate funds for his own use. He requests that any papers currently in your possession, papers he believes originated from your father's tenure, be surrendered to the estate for proper review. Marianne felt the floor seemed to tilt slightly beneath her, and beside her she was aware of Gerard going very still, his jaw tight, though he said nothing yet, apparently waiting to see how far Colbert intended to carry this. Colbert stepped forward and produced a folder of papers, laying them before the squire with the calm, unhurried confidence of a man who believed himself entirely secure. I regret bringing this before the magistrate at all, he said, his voice heavy with practiced sorrow. But I discovered these accounts only recently while reviewing old estate records, and I could not in good conscience remain silent. Walter Hale was, I am sorry to say, not the honest servant many believed him to be. Gerard stepped forward before Marianne could speak. his voice low and dangerous in a way she had not yet heard from him. "May I see these documents, Mr. Colbert?" "Of course, Your Grace," Colbert said, handing them over with every appearance of reluctant duty. Gerard studied the pages carefully, and Marianne watched his expression change from controlled anger to something colder and more focused, a man recognizing a forgery when he saw one. The handwriting, while a careful imitation of her father's careful hand, was subtly wrong, in ways only someone who had spent hours the day before poring over Walter Hale's genuine ledgers would notice. The loops of certain letters slightly too rounded, the pressure of the pen too even throughout, lacking the small tremors her father's illness had left in every line he wrote in his final years. "These are false," Gerard said flatly, loud enough for the room to hear. "I have spent the better part of yesterday reading Walter Hale's genuine hand, and this is not it." "Your Grace," Colbert said, spreading his hands in a gesture of wounded patience, "I understand this is difficult, given your evident regard for Miss Hale, but I did not create these documents. I merely discovered them among the estate papers, precisely where they had been filed years ago." "Then produce the file where you claim to have found them," Gerard said. "Produce the clerk who logged their receipt, if such records exist as they should, for anything entered into the estate archive." Colbert's composure flickered, just barely, before he recovered it. "I am certain such records exist, Your Grace, though it may take some days to locate them among the disorder left from years of neglect." "Convenient," Gerard said, "that the proof of authenticity should require days to produce, while the accusation itself was ready within a single morning." Squire Bellamy, watching this exchange with visible discomfort, cleared his throat and raised a hand for quiet. "Your Grace, Mr. Colbert, I have no wish to preside over a dispute between the Duke and his own steward, particularly one that appears to touch on matters of some sensitivity regarding Miss Hale's personal situation. I would ask that both parties bring their evidence before me properly, in writing, and allow me time to consider the matter with the seriousness it deserves, rather than settling it here in temper." It was, Marianne understood, a fair and cautious position for a magistrate to take, and yet it left her standing publicly accused, her father's name freshly stained before half the village had likely already heard some version of the tale by nightfall, given how quickly word traveled through Renwick. She felt Gerard's hand find hers briefly, hidden by the fold of her skirts, a small, steadying pressure that she was grateful for even as humiliation burned hot in her chest. The meeting dissolved shortly after, with no resolution reached, and Marianne walked from the magistrate's house with her spine straight and her eyes fixed forward, refusing to let the curious, whispering onlookers gathered outside see how deeply the morning had wounded her. Behind her, Marianne heard fragments of the whispers already spreading among the small crowd that had gathered outside the magistrate's house, voices not quite low enough to escape her hearing. "A thief's daughter," one woman murmured to another. "No wonder she was always so proud," said a second. Marianne kept her eyes forward and her steps even, though each word landed like a small, cold stone against her chest, and by the time she reached the edge of the square her hands had begun to tremble despite her best effort to master them. Gerard caught up with her at the edge of the square, his expression grim. "This is my fault," he said. "I moved too openly. I should have gathered every proof quietly before giving him any reason to suspect we were close to exposing him." "You could not have known he would strike so quickly," Marianne said, though her voice was unsteady, the composure she had held throughout the meeting finally beginning to crack now that they were away from watching eyes. "He has had years to prepare for exactly this possibility." "I am the easier target, Gerard. A duke's word carries weight even when questioned. A dead land agent's daughter has almost none at all." "That is not true," Gerard said fiercely, but even as he said it, he understood the practical truth beneath her words, and it settled in him like a stone. Back at the hall, Marianne found Mrs. Whitfield waiting near the servants' entrance, her thin face drawn with worry, and to Marianne's surprise the housekeeper drew her aside into the empty still room rather than simply passing her by as courtesy alone required. "I heard what happened at the magistrate's house," Mrs. Whitfield said quietly, glancing toward the door as though fearful of being overheard. "I want you to know, Miss Hale, that I never believed a word Mr. Colbert said of your father. Walter Hale paid my own brother's wages out of his own pocket one hard winter, when the estate funds were slow in coming, and never once mentioned it again nor asked to be repaid. A man like that does not become a thief in his final years merely because illness slowed his hand." Marianne felt her composure waver dangerously at the unexpected kindness, tears rising hot and unwelcome behind her eyes. "Thank you," she managed. "You do not know what it means to hear that today. Of all days." "I know more than you might think," Mrs. Whitfield said, her voice dropping lower still. I have kept my own eyes open these past years, though I never dared speak of what I noticed. Wages delayed that should not have been. Tradesmen paid in full for work only half finished. I said nothing, because I have 3 children to feed and no husband living to help me feed them, and a housekeeper who speaks too freely against the steward does not long keep her position. But if his grace truly means to see this through, tell him he need only ask, and I will say what I know, whatever it costs me. It was a small thing, one frightened woman's quiet promise in a dim still room, but it settled something in Mary Ann that the morning's humiliation had badly shaken, a reminder that Colbert's careful web of fear and convenient silence was not, perhaps, as complete as he believed it to be. That evening, an unexpected visitor arrived at Renwick Hall, an old family friend named Lord Pemberton, who had known Gerard's father for 40 years and had ridden over the moment word of the magistrates' meeting reached him. He was shown into the study where Gerard sat alone, staring unseeing into the fire, and he wasted little time on pleasantries. "I have heard an unfortunate account of your morning," Pemberton said, settling into a chair without invitation, his weathered face creased with genuine concern. "A public dispute with your own steward over documents concerning a dead land agent, all conducted in front of half the village, with a young woman of uncertain reputation standing at the center of it. Your father would not have handled the matter so carelessly, Gerard, and I say that with affection, not unkindness." "The documents against her father are forged," Gerard said tightly. "Colbert has been stealing from this estate for years. I have the proof in a strong room not 30 feet above this study." Pemberton's eyebrows rose, and for a moment something like belief flickered across his face, before caution reasserted itself. "Perhaps that is true. I do not doubt your conviction, nor entirely your judgment on the matter of the accounts. But consider how this appears from outside this room. You have known this woman 2 days, Gerard. 2 days, and already you are prepared to set your own steward's word against hers, in public, before you have properly proven anything. If you are wrong, even partly wrong, the damage to your own standing, and to hers, will not easily be undone." "I am not wrong," Gerard said. "Then prove it properly," Pemberton said, not unkindly, "with time and care, rather than temper and haste. And in the meantime, for her sake as much as your own, consider whether it might be wiser to send Miss Hale away from Renwick for a time, until the matter is settled beyond any doubt. Let her name be cleared by evidence alone, not by her proximity to you, which only feeds the very gossip you claim to despise." Gerard said nothing for a long while after Pemberton left, the older man's words sitting uneasily alongside everything else weighing on him, and it was very late that night when a note arrived from Mary Ann herself, brief and carefully composed, informing him that she had decided, after long reflection, that it would be best for both their sakes if she left Renwick for a time, perhaps to stay with a distant cousin in the north, until whatever came next had been resolved without her presence complicating matters further. Gerard read the note twice by candlelight, and felt something close to panic rise in him, sharp and unfamiliar, at the thought of her simply leaving, disappearing back into whatever quiet, careful life she had built for herself, before the storm that first brought her to his door. He did not sleep that night. He sat instead with the strong box of evidence open before him on the desk, Walter Hale's careful, trembling handwriting spread across the pages, and understood with sudden, complete clarity that Pemberton's caution, however well meant, was the same kind of comfortable delay that had already cost this family and this estate 6 wasted years. He would not make that mistake again, not with the accounts, and not with Mary Ann Hale. Whatever it took, he decided, watching the candle burn low toward morning, he would find the final proof needed to end this before she could leave Renwick at all. He thought of Mrs. Whitfield's quiet promise, relayed to him earlier that evening by a nervous footman too loyal to Mary Ann to keep it entirely to himself, and he thought too of Pemberton's warning, well meant but rooted in a caution that had already cost this family too much. His father had been a cautious man in his final years, unwilling to press hard questions on a steward who managed everything so smoothly on the surface, and that same caution had allowed 6 years of theft to pass unchallenged, while an honest land agent died believing his warnings would go forever unheeded. Gerard would not repeat that mistake, whatever it cost his own reputation in the short term. He drew a fresh sheet of paper toward him and began, methodically, to list every person who might corroborate what the hidden ledgers already showed, starting with Mrs. Whitfield's name and working outward from there, tenants who had grumbled about timber prices, tradesmen who had waited too long for payment. Anyone whose small, ordinary grievance might, gathered together with all the others, form a case too large and too consistent for even Colbert's practiced smile to explain away. By the time the sky outside his window had begun to lighten toward dawn, he had filled 3 pages with names and notes. and something in him, exhausted but resolute, understood that the coming days would require more courage from him than he had shown in years of comfortable absence abroad. He folded Marianne's note carefully and set it inside his coat, beside the place where her father's letter had rested only 2 nights before, and made himself a quiet promise that he would not let her walk away from Renwick believing herself unwanted, or unproven, or alone in this fight a moment longer than necessary. Whatever Colbert intended next, Gerard intended to be ready for it, and he intended, above all else, to make certain that when the truth finally came to light, it would be too complete, too well supported, and too public for anyone, magistrate or gossiping villager alike, to doubt it for even a moment. Earlier that same evening, before the fire, before the smoke, Gerard had sat with Lord Pemberton's list still spread across his desk, working through the names of tenants and tradesmen he intended to visit in the coming days, when a hurried note arrived from Marianne, delivered by the same red-faced boy who had summoned her to the magistrate 2 days before. She had not left for the north after all, the note explained, unable to bring herself to abandon Renwick while so much remained unresolved, and she had instead spent the afternoon quietly speaking with tenants along the western boundary of the estate, gathering exactly the sort of small, corroborating detail Gerard had hoped to collect himself. 3 tenants, she wrote, had independently confirmed timber wagons passing through their land late at night, always on the same nights each month, always bound toward the county town rather than the usual mill. A 4th remembered paying his rent in full, in coin, directly into Colbert's own hand, only to be told months later that his account showed an outstanding balance, a discrepancy he had been too intimidated to challenge at the time. Gerard had read the note with rising hope, understanding that between Mrs. Whitfield's promised testimony, the hidden ledgers, and now Marianne's patient afternoon of quiet inquiry, the case against Colbert was growing far too substantial for any forged document to overturn. He had drafted a reply asking her to meet him at first light, so they might compare everything gathered and prepare a full account for the magistrate together, and he had just sealed the letter for a servant to carry down to the village, before finally retiring for what little remained of the night. Smoke woke him only a few hours later, a thin, acrid thread of it curling beneath his bedchamber door, and Gerard was on his feet and moving before he had fully understood why, some animal instinct driving him into the corridor even as his mind caught up with what his body already knew. The estate office was burning. He took the stairs 2 at a time, pulling on his coat as he ran, and reached the ground floor to find the household already in chaos, Mrs. Whitfield directing frightened maids toward buckets and water, a footman hammering at the office door, which stood locked from within despite the smoke now visibly seeping from beneath it and around its frame. "Where is Colbert?" Gerard demanded. "No one has seen him since supper, Your Grace," the footman said, his face pale in the flickering light of the corridor lamps. Gerard threw his shoulder against the door once, twice, and on the 3rd attempt the old lock gave way, the door crashing open to release a billowing wave of smoke and heat that drove him back a step before he steadied himself and plunged inside. The estate office was well ablaze, papers curling to black ash across the desk, flames already climbing the nearest bookshelf, and there, at the far side of the room, struggling with an armful of ledgers he was clearly attempting to carry clear of the fire before it consumed the rest, was Edwin Colbert himself, coughing violently in the thickening smoke. For one terrible moment, Gerard understood everything at once. This was no accident. Colbert had set the fire himself, intending to destroy whatever remained in the estate office that might corroborate the hidden ledgers, and had lingered too long trying to salvage the specific papers that mattered most to his own defense, whatever those might be. "Get out," Gerard shouted, grabbing the man's arm and hauling him toward the door, the ledgers spilling from Colbert's grip and scattering across the burning floor. "The whole room will go up within minutes." They stumbled together into the corridor, and household staff swarmed past them into the office with buckets of water, working with the desperate, coordinated haste of people fighting to save their own home, while Gerard pulled Colbert further back, both men coughing and streaked with soot, and only then, in the chaos and flickering light, did Gerard notice the small, half-burned satchel still clutched in Colbert's other hand. "What is that?" Gerard said, his voice gone hard and cold despite the smoke still burning in his throat. Colbert's eyes darted toward the front doors, some calculation of escape flickering behind his soot-streaked face. But Marianne's voice cut across the chaos before he could act on it, sharp and clear even amid the shouting. "Do not let him leave," she called, arriving at a run from the direction of the village road, her cloak thrown hastily over her nightdress, having seen the glow of fire against the sky from her cottage window, and run the whole distance without stopping. "Gerard, that satchel. It is my father's second box of papers. The ones I always believed were taken the night our cottage was broken into. He has had them all along. Colbert, cornered now between the fire behind him and the growing crowd of servants and villagers gathering at the sound of the commotion, seemed for a moment to consider running anyway, his eyes flicking toward the dark park beyond the drive, before something in his composure finally broke entirely. The easy, confident mask he had worn for years crumbling all at once into something desperate and much smaller. "I never meant for it to become so much," he said, his voice raw. Whether from smoke or something closer to genuine feeling, Gerard could not tell. "It began small, a little here, a little there, while your father's health failed, and no one thought to check too closely. And then it was too much to stop, too much to explain, and every year I told myself I would set it right eventually, once I had recovered what I had already taken, and every year that day never came." "You forged evidence against a dead man to protect yourself," Gerard said, his voice shaking now with an anger he no longer troubled himself to control. "You let his daughter be humiliated before the whole village. You broke into her home and stole from a dying man's bedside. And tonight you set fire to my own house rather than face what you had done." "I did not think the fire would spread so far," Colbert said weakly, which was, Gerard thought, perhaps the first entirely honest thing the man had said since his return to Renwick. The bucket line held for nearly 20 minutes before the flames finally began to yield. Household staff and several villagers who had seen the glow from their own windows and come running to help, passing buckets hand to hand from the kitchen well, while Gerard directed them from just inside the smoke-filled doorway, his eyes stinging, his lungs raw from the effort of shouting instructions over the roar of the fire and the crash of a collapsing shelf. Twice he thought the flames had beaten them, watching a fresh tongue of fire leap up along the curtains before a well-aimed bucket doused it, and twice the line of exhausted, soot-streaked helpers pressed forward anyway, unwilling to let the fire claim more of the house than it already had. By the time the last stubborn ember was finally smothered, the estate office stood gutted and black, its shelves collapsed, its desk reduced to a charred ruin, but the fire had not spread beyond the single room, contained at last by the desperate, coordinated effort of people who, Gerard understood watching them work, had far more reason to love this house and protect it than the man who had very nearly burned a piece of it to the ground. The village constable arrived within the hour, summoned by a rider Mrs. Whitfield had sent the moment the fire was discovered, and Colbert was taken into custody with the satchel of stolen papers as immediate proof, alongside the household staff who now, freed at last from years of quiet fear, came forward one after another with accounts of delayed wages and strange irregularities they had noticed but never dared report. Mrs. Whitfield herself gave a full account before the constable, her voice steady despite years of silence finally broken, describing wages delayed and tradesmen shortchanged with a clarity that left no room for doubt, and within the office itself, once the fire was fully extinguished and the smoke cleared enough to search the ruined room, enough charred but legible fragments of Colbert's own private records survived to corroborate everything the hidden ledgers had already shown. The constable, a solid, unhurried man named Otterby, who had served the district for 20 years and had little patience for gentlemen who thought their station excused them from the law, examined the satchel of recovered papers with grim satisfaction. "This alone would see him before the assizes," he said, glancing toward Colbert, now seated under guard on an overturned bucket near the ruined doorway, his fine coat streaked with soot and his composure entirely gone. Add the fire itself, set deliberately by his own admission, not an hour passed in front of witnesses enough to fill a courtroom twice over, and I do not think Mr. Colbert will trouble this estate again for a great many years. Colbert said nothing more, sitting hollow-eyed and silent as the first light of dawn crept over the ruined office windows, and Gerard, looking at the man who had so nearly destroyed both his family's legacy and an innocent woman's reputation to protect his own comfort, found he felt less triumph than a kind of tired, sorrowful relief that it was, at last, finally over. It was near dawn by the time the chaos finally settled, the fire fully out, the office a blackened ruin but the rest of the house untouched, and Gerard found Marianne sitting alone on the front steps, wrapped in a blanket someone had pressed upon her, watching the last wisps of smoke curl up into the graying sky. He sat beside her without a word, both of them too exhausted for speech at first, streaked with soot and hollow-eyed with the long night behind them, until finally she spoke, her voice quiet and unsteady in a way he had not heard from her before, not even at her most vulnerable moments over the past difficult days. "He had my father's papers the whole time," she said. 6 years I believed I had lost that box forever, believed whatever proof it held was gone along with the peace of mind of ever knowing exactly what he stole from my father, or why he was so desperate to be rid of it. "It is over now," Gerard said. Whatever was in that box, whatever remains to be proven, it will be proven properly now, before the magistrate, with evidence no one can dismiss as forgery or convenient timing. Marianne turned to look at him then, her face pale and tired in the thin dawn light, but something steadier in her eyes than he had seen since the night they first met in the storm. I did not think, when I stood on that drive 2 nights ago, that it would end like this. I imagined confrontation, certainly. I imagined disbelief, and difficulty, and perhaps failure if I am honest. I did not imagine fire, or a duke pulling a thief bodily from a burning room, or myself sitting here at dawn feeling, for the first time in 6 years, that my father's name might finally be safe. Your father would be proud of you, Gerard said. Prouder, I think, than he ever had occasion to say while he lived. Her composure, held so carefully through every trial of the past 2 days, finally broke then, tears rising and spilling before she could stop them, and Gerard, without entirely deciding to do so, drew her against him, and she did not resist, her hand curling into the front of his ruined, smoke-stained coat as she wept for a father 6 years gone and finally, truly vindicated. They sat together like that for a long while as the sky lightened fully into morning, neither speaking, the ruined estate office smoking quietly behind them, and the whole household finally settling into an exhausted, relieved stillness after the longest night Renwick had endured in years. What happens now? Marianne asked eventually, drawing back enough to look at him, though she did not move far from his side. Now, Gerard said, the magistrate will have his proof, properly gathered and impossible to dismiss, and your father's name will be cleared before the whole village, publicly, exactly as it deserves to be. And Edwin Colbert will answer for every part of what he has done, to this estate, and to your family both. And after that? Gerard looked at her for a long moment, taking in the soot on her cheek, the exhaustion in her eyes, the quiet, unbroken strength that had carried her through 6 years of loneliness and 2 days of public humiliation, without once losing herself entirely to despair, and felt something settle in his chest that he recognized, with some surprise, as certainty. After that, he said, I find I am considerably less interested in what happens to the estate than in what happens to you. But that is a conversation for a day when neither of us smells of smoke, and neither of us has been awake through the entire night. A tired, unguarded laugh escaped her then, the first real laugh he had heard from her since they met, and something in it eased the last of the night's terrible tension from both their shoulders. Then I shall hold you to that conversation, Your Grace, she said. Gerard, he corrected, gently. Gerard, she agreed, and this time the name came easily, without hesitation, as though the long night behind them had finally worn away whatever careful distance she had still been keeping between herself and the man who had proven, in the end, exactly as trustworthy as her father had once hoped he would be. Behind them, the sun rose fully over Renwick Hall, gilding the scorched stone of the office windows and the wet, ash-streaked gravel of the drive, and somewhere in the village below, word was already spreading of the night's events, a story that would be told and retold for years to come, of the steward's fall and the land agent's vindication, and of the Duke and the quiet, determined woman who had stood together at the center of it all. Mrs. Whitfield emerged from the house some time later, carrying 2 cups of hot tea, and pressed them wordlessly into Gerard and Marianne's hands before retreating again, her own eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion, but her expression, for the first time since Gerard's return, entirely unburdened. Around them, the household staff who had fought the fire through the night began, slowly, to disperse toward their beds, several pausing to offer Marianne a small nod or a murmured word of respect that would have been unthinkable only 2 days before, when whispers of a thief's daughter had followed her through the village square. They believe you now, Gerard said quietly, watching one of the younger footmen incline his head toward her as he passed. Truly believe you, not merely because a duke has vouched for you, but because they have seen the truth of it themselves tonight. It matters more than I expected it to, Marianne admitted, wrapping both hands around the warm cup Mrs. Whitfield had given her. I told myself for years that I did not need the village's good opinion, that my father's name mattered more to me than what anyone else believed of it. But it is easier to say such things than to feel them, when you have spent 6 years watching people cross the street rather than speak with you. That is finished now, Gerard said. Whatever else changes in the days ahead, that at least is finished for good. They sat together a while longer, watching the last of the smoke thin and vanish against the brightening sky, and Gerard found himself thinking, not for the first time in the past 2 days, that whatever he had expected to find upon his return to Renwick, a ruined steward, a burning office, and a woman whose quiet courage had outlasted 6 years of loneliness and 2 days of public shame, had certainly not been among his expectations. And yet, watching her now, calm and steady even in her exhaustion, the first true smile he had seen from her beginning to form as the household staff passed with their small, respectful nods, he found he could imagine no version of his homecoming he would have preferred over this one. Gerard woke that morning to the smell of smoke still lingering faintly in the corridors, a reminder of how narrowly the night before had ended in disaster rather than triumph, and he lay for a moment staring at the ceiling of his own bedchamber, turning over everything that had happened since the storm first brought a stranger to his drive. 6 days. It hardly seemed possible that so much could shift in so short a span. A household rescued, a thief exposed, a dead man's name restored, and something else besides, something he was only now beginning to properly name to himself as he dressed and made his way down through the quiet, ash-scented halls. He found Squire Bellamy already waiting in the entrance hall, having ridden over at first light once word of the fire and Colbert's confession reached him, his tired face set in the grave, careful expression of a magistrate who understood the gravity of what the day ahead required. Beside him stood the constable, Otterby, and behind them both, framed in the open doorway with the morning sun at her back, stood Mary Ann, dressed simply as always, though something in her bearing this morning struck Gerard as different, lighter somehow, as though a weight she had carried so long she had nearly forgotten its shape had finally, truly lifted from her shoulders. "The village has heard already," Bellamy said without preamble, though not unkindly. "Word of a fire travels faster than any messenger, your grace, and word of a steward led away in irons faster still. I would suggest you address the matter publicly and plainly, before rumor has the chance to twist it into something less than the truth deserves." Gerard glanced toward Mary Ann and found her watching him with a steady, questioning look, as though asking silently whether he intended to do exactly what the squire suggested and whether he wished her beside him when he did. "I intend to," Gerard said, to both of them at once, "every part of it, plainly, before the whole village, so that no shadow of doubt remains over your father's name, nor over yours." The church bell had barely finished ringing before the whole village began gathering on the green below Renwick Hall, drawn by word that had spread overnight of a public announcement the Duke himself intended to make, and by the time Gerard walked out onto the wide stone steps at the front of the house, tenants and shopkeepers and household staff alike stood crowded together in the morning sun, waiting. Mary Ann stood near the front of the gathering, dressed simply as always, though Gerard noticed several of the village women who had once whispered behind their hands now standing close beside her, offering quiet words of encouragement that would have been unthinkable only a week before. Squire Bellamy stood a little apart, his expression grave but attentive, and beside him, under careful guard, stood Edwin Colbert, awaiting the formal reading of the charges that would send him before the assizes. Gerard raised a hand, and the murmuring crowd fell quiet. "6 days ago, I returned to Renwick after too many years away," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the green. "I found an estate in disrepair, a household living in quiet fear, and a man I had trusted to manage both, revealed, within days, to have betrayed that trust more completely than I could have imagined. Edwin Colbert has confessed, before witnesses and before the constable, to years of theft from this estate, to the forging of documents intended to destroy the reputation of an honest man no longer able to defend himself, and to setting fire to my own house in a final, desperate attempt to hide what he had done." A ripple of reaction moved through the crowd, though none of it, Gerard noted, carried much surprise. They had suspected, most of them, in the quiet way people always suspect what they dare not say aloud, and hearing it confirmed, seemed to loosen something in the gathered villagers, an old, unspoken tension finally allowed to break. "That man," Gerard continued, "the one Colbert tried hardest to destroy, was Walter Hale, who served this family faithfully for 11 years, and was dismissed unjustly for asking questions no one wished to answer. Walter Hale did not steal from this estate, he protected it, at great cost to himself and his family, gathering proof of Colbert's theft in secret for years, trusting that one day someone would come home willing to see the truth." He turned then toward Mary Ann, and felt the whole crowd's attention shift with him, 100 pairs of eyes settling on the woman who had spent 6 years enduring quiet suspicion for a crime that had never been hers, nor her father's, to bear. Mary Ann Hale carried that trust for 6 years, alone, at considerable personal cost, including public humiliation before this very village only 2 days ago, based on evidence we now know to have been deliberately forged. I want every person here to understand clearly that Walter Hale's name is fully and publicly restored, that his daughter's conduct throughout this entire matter has been beyond reproach, and that Renwick owes both of them a debt this estate can never fully repay. He paused, and in the quiet that followed, Squire Bellamy stepped forward to formally read the charges against Colbert, his voice steady and official, listing theft, forgery, and arson, in language that left no ambiguity for anyone listening. Colbert stood through the reading with his eyes fixed on the ground, offering no protest, no final defense, the last of his careful composure entirely gone, and when the constable finally led him away toward the waiting cart that would carry him to the county gaol, no one in the crowd spoke a word on his behalf. It was only once the cart had rattled out of sight down the drive that the mood on the green shifted entirely, the gathered villagers turning to one another with low, relieved murmurs, and several of the older tenants making their way forward to offer Marianne their hands, their apologies, their quiet, awkward words of respect that she accepted with a composure Gerard admired more with each passing moment. An elderly farmer named Josiah Rutledge, whose family had worked the western fields under 3 generations of Ashworth Dukes, was among the first to approach her, removing his hat as he did so, a gesture of respect Gerard suspected the old man rarely extended to anyone outside his own family. "Your father once forgave half a season's rent when the flood took my lower field," Rutledge said gruffly, his eyes suspiciously bright. "I never forgot it, Miss Hale. Whatever this village has whispered these past years, I am glad to see the truth finally spoken aloud." Marianne thanked him, her voice unsteady, and behind Rutledge came others, a baker's wife who remembered Walter Hale's kindness during a hard winter, a young stable hand who had been too afraid of losing his position to speak up about wages withheld, each offering some small fragment of memory or apology that, gathered together, began to form something like the full portrait of a man whose quiet decency had been buried for years beneath Colbert's careful lies. Gerard watched it all with a fullness in his chest he had not expected, understanding that this slow, public unburdening mattered as much to Renwick's healing as the formal reading of charges had, perhaps more, since it was the village's own voice restoring what had been taken, rather than merely the laws. He let the crowd have its time, watching from the steps as 6 years of quiet isolation slowly, visibly, began to dissolve around her, before he finally descended and crossed to where she stood, the last of the well-wishers drifting back to make room for him. "You did not tell me you intended to say all of that," Marianne said quietly, once they had a moment of relative privacy. "I did not entirely plan it," Gerard admitted, "but every word of it was true, and I found, once I began, that I did not wish to leave any of it unsaid." They walked together away from the thinning crowd, toward the small chapel at the edge of the park, its doors standing open for the first time in years, having been cleaned and aired that very morning at Mrs. Whitfield's quiet insistence, though she had given no particular reason for the sudden effort. Inside, the light fell soft and golden through old, dusty windows onto simple wooden pews, and Marianne paused just inside the doorway, looking around at a space she had clearly not entered in a long while. "My father was married in this chapel," she said softly, "and I was christened here, though I remember little of it, of course. It has been closed since before your father's death. I did not think anyone would open it again." "I asked Mrs. Whitfield to see it prepared," Gerard said. "I thought, given everything that has happened this week, that Renwick deserved to remember what this house was meant to be, before neglect and theft nearly buried it entirely." They walked slowly up the narrow aisle together, Marianne's fingers trailing lightly along the worn edge of each pew as they passed, and Gerard found himself watching her rather than the chapel itself, struck again by how completely his understanding of her had shifted in the space of less than a week. He had arrived at Renwick a tired, guarded man, convinced that duty alone would have to carry him through whatever remained of his obligations to a house he no longer felt he belonged to. He had not expected a storm, nor a stranger's key, nor the slow, steady unraveling of everything he thought he understood about his own home. He certainly had not expected to find himself standing in a reopened chapel, his chest tight with a feeling he had not allowed himself in years, watching a woman he had known only days study the altar where her own parents had once stood. "I used to imagine this place full again," Marianne said quietly, half to herself. "My father would describe it to me sometimes, in his last months, when the fever made him restless and unable to sleep. He said Renwick's chapel was never meant to stand empty, that a house forgets itself slowly when its heart is left dark too long." "Then let us not leave it dark any longer," Gerard said. Marianne turned to look at him, something searching in her expression, and Gerard, feeling his own heart beating faster than the moment strictly warranted, reached into his coat and drew out the iron key she had pressed into his hand on that first storm-soaked night, the same key that had unlocked the tower stair and, in its way, unlocked everything that followed. "You gave me this," he said, not knowing whether I would prove worthy of the trust it represented. "I have thought a great deal, these past days, about what it would mean to give it back to you, not as a secret keeper any longer, not as someone carrying a burden alone in the dark, but as mistress of this house, if you would have it, and me, together." Marianne's breath caught audibly in the quiet chapel, her eyes bright with something that was not quite tears and not quite laughter, though it held elements of both. "Gerard," she said, "are you asking me to marry you in the same chapel where you have just publicly praised my conduct before the entire village, not one full day after your steward was led away in chains?" "I am aware of the timing," Gerard said, a rare, unguarded smile breaking across his tired face. "I considered waiting for a more conventional occasion, but I have already made the mistake once this week of delaying something important out of caution, and I find I have no wish to repeat it, particularly not in a matter that concerns my own happiness quite so directly." She took the key from his outstretched hand, turning it over once in her fingers exactly as he had done on the night she first gave it to him, and then she looked up, her expression finally, fully unguarded for the first time since the storm. "Then yes," she said, "though I would remind you that I have spent 6 years being careful, and patient, and quiet about everything I truly wanted, and I find, now that the waiting is finally over, that I am not inclined to wait a moment longer than necessary for this either." Gerard laughed then, a full, unrestrained sound that surprised even himself, and drew her into his arms in the golden light of the reopened chapel, the key still held between their joined hands, no longer a secret to be guarded but a promise, openly given, of everything Renwick and its people might yet become now that the truth had finally, fully come to light. Outside, the village green was still busy with the last of the morning's gathering, word already beginning to spread of what had passed inside the little chapel, carried by a housemaid who had glimpsed the embrace through a dusty window and could not, understandably, keep such news to herself for long. By evening, all of Renwick would know that their duke intended to marry the land agent's daughter, and that the estate, so nearly ruined by one man's quiet greed, had found instead an unexpected and entirely welcome new beginning. Mrs. Whitfield, when she heard the news, simply smiled and returned to her work with a lightness in her step that had not been seen at Renwick Hall in years, already planning, in the quiet way of housekeepers everywhere, exactly how the great house might look dressed for a wedding come spring. In the days that followed, Gerard set about the slow, necessary work of setting Renwick right, appointing a new steward recommended by Squire Bellamy himself, a careful, plain-spoken man with no patience for the kind of flattering evasions Colbert had built his years of theft upon. Wages long overdue were paid in full, the household staff receiving them with a quiet disbelief that told Gerard, more clearly than any account book could, exactly how long they had waited for such simple justice. The east rooms were opened once more, aired and cleaned under Mrs. Whitfield's brisk direction, and slowly, room by room, the house began to feel less like a place slowly emptied of everything that once made it alive, and more like the home Gerard remembered from his childhood, before grief and distance had let it fall so quietly into ruin. Marianne came to the hall each day now, no longer as a suspected fraud's daughter creeping quietly through servants' passages, but openly, welcomed at the front door by staff who had, within the space of a single remarkable week, come to regard her with something close to affection. She worked alongside Gerard reviewing the estate's true financial state, her sharp memory for figures proving as useful in restoration as it had been in exposing the theft that made restoration necessary, and more than once Gerard caught himself simply watching her work, struck again by the quiet, steady competence that had first drawn his notice on a rain-soaked drive less than 2 weeks before. Word of Colbert's trial reached Renwick some weeks later, delivered by a brief, formal letter from the county assizes confirming his conviction on all charges, and a lengthy sentence that would keep him well away from any estate for a very long time to come. Gerard read the letter aloud to Marianne in the study where so much of their careful investigation had first taken shape, and when he finished, she said nothing for a long moment, only nodded slowly, some final knot of tension finally easing from her shoulders after 6 long years of carrying it. "It is strange," she said eventually. "I expected to feel triumphant hearing that. Instead, I find I mostly feel tired, and grateful, and ready to think of something other than accounts and forged letters for a good while yet." "Then let us think of something else," Gerard said, and drew from his coat a small folded paper, a rough sketch Mrs. Whitfield had helped him prepare of the chapel decorated for a spring wedding, garlands along the old stone walls and fresh flowers at the altar where Marianne's own parents had once stood. She laughed at the sight of it, bright and unguarded, and leaned against his shoulder to study the sketch more closely, And Gerard thought, watching her, that whatever trials Renwick had endured under Colbert's quiet greed, the house had gained, in the end, something far more valuable than it had lost. A mistress who understood exactly what it meant to love a place enough to fight for its truth, however long that fight took, and however alone she had once been forced to carry it. The first cart of the harvest rolled up the Renwick Drive just as the morning mist was lifting, and Marianne stood at the top of the front steps watching it come, her hand resting lightly on the same stone balustrade where, a year before, she had stood beside Gerard while a soot-streaked crowd gathered below to hear the truth spoken aloud at last. So much had changed in that year that she sometimes found herself pausing, mid-task, simply to notice it, the way sunlight now fell freely into rooms that had stood shuttered for years, the way household staff greeted her each morning with easy, familiar warmth, rather than careful, uncertain courtesy. The East Wing stood fully restored, its paintings returned to walls Gerard had commissioned a local artist to repair where damp had done its worst. The estate office, rebuilt entirely from its charred foundation, now employed a plain, careful steward who kept accounts so meticulously precise that Marianne, reviewing them each month out of habit, more than necessity now, had never once found a discrepancy worth questioning. "You are wool gathering again," Gerard said, coming up beside her with 2 cups of tea, having learned over the past year exactly when to interrupt her thoughts and when to let them run their course. "I was only thinking how different this looks from a year ago," she said, accepting the cup. "Do you remember how empty the drive seemed, that first morning, how quiet the whole house felt?" "I remember a great deal about that morning," Gerard said, glancing sideways at her with the particular warmth that had become, over the past year, entirely familiar to her, no longer surprising, but no less treasured for its familiarity. "I remember a woman standing in the rain who nearly cost me my horse's good temper for a fortnight." Marianne laughed, the sound carrying easily across the busy drive below, where tenants and household staff alike moved back and forth preparing for the harvest festival Renwick would host that evening, the first such gathering the estate had managed since long before Gerard's father died. Long tables were being carried out onto the lower lawn, garlanded with late summer flowers under Mrs. Whitfield's exacting supervision, and somewhere behind the house, the unmistakable smell of roasting meat had already begun drifting on the afternoon air. She thought sometimes, in quiet moments like this one, of Mrs. Whitfield's small, frightened promise given in the dim still-room on the worst morning of the whole ordeal, and of how much courage it had taken for a woman with 3 children and no husband to risk speaking against a man as carefully protected as Colbert had once seemed. Mrs. Whitfield had stayed on at Renwick, promoted now to a position of real trust and authority within the household, her wages generous and always paid promptly, and she had become, over the past year, something between a friend and a second mother to Marianne. The two of them often found together in the kitchen of an evening, discussing the household accounts or simply talking, easily, about nothing of great importance at all. She thought too, less often now but still sometimes, of the 6 years before Gerard's return, the long, careful loneliness of guarding a secret she could share with no one, of walking through the village each week feeling the weight of suspicion she had never earned. She did not regret those years entirely, understanding now how they had shaped the patient, steady woman Gerard had first encountered on the storm-soaked drive, but she was glad, deeply and simply glad, to have finally set that burden down. It had been Marianne's idea, the festival, proposed some months earlier when she noticed how many of the estate's old traditions, once common under Gerard's father, had simply faded away during the lean, careful years of Colbert's management, when nothing was spent that did not strictly need to be, and certainly nothing so frivolous as a harvest gathering for tenants who could barely be certain of their own wages from one quarter to the next. Restoring it had felt, to her, like restoring one more small piece of what Renwick had nearly lost entirely, and watching the preparations now, the easy laughter of villagers who a year ago had crossed the street rather than speak with her, she felt a quiet, settled satisfaction that no ledger or account book could ever quite capture. "Rutledge asked this morning whether you intended to judge the plowing competition again this year," Gerard said. "He seems to believe your father's old scoring method superior to whatever the county fair uses, and has been quite vocal in defending it to anyone who will listen." "My father did have strong opinions about furrow depth," Marianne admitted, smiling at the memory. "I suppose I shall have to disappoint the county fair judges and agree with him." They walked down together to oversee the last of the preparations, greeting tenants and staff along the way, and Marianne found herself, as she often did now, comparing the easy warmth of these exchanges against the careful, guarded distance she had maintained for 6 long years before Gerard's return, when speaking too openly with anyone risked drawing exactly the kind of scrutiny that had nearly destroyed her father's memory entirely. She did not resent those years, not any longer, understanding now that the patience and care they had demanded of her had, in their own difficult way, prepared her for everything that followed. But she was glad, deeply and simply glad, that they were behind her. By evening, the lower lawn was full. Tenants and villagers gathered around long tables laden with food, children chasing one another between the legs of adults too occupied with conversation and cider to mind the noise. And somewhere near the makeshift dance floor, a small group of musicians had struck up a lively tune that drew even the more reluctant guests toward the grass to join in. Gerard found Marianne near the edge of the gathering, watching it all with the particular quiet contentment she wore so naturally now, and held out his hand. "Dance with me," he said. "I am hardly dressed for it," she said, gesturing at her plain, practical gown, entirely unsuited to the elegant assemblies she had occasionally glimpsed described in county newspapers. "Neither is half this gathering," Gerard said, "and I find I do not much care. This is Renwick's celebration, and I intend to celebrate it properly, with my wife, in whatever she happens to be wearing." Marianne took his hand, laughing despite herself, and let him draw her out among the other dancing couples, tenants and household staff mixed freely together, in a way that would have scandalized more formal households but felt, here, entirely and simply right. They moved through the dance a little clumsily, both of them more accustomed to account books than ballrooms, and somewhere in the middle of it, spinning slowly beneath the first stars appearing over Renwick's restored towers, Marianne caught sight of Mrs. Whitfield watching them from near the tables, her expression soft with an affection that had grown, over the past year, into something closer to family than mere service. Later, once the music had quieted and most of the guests had begun the slow walk back toward the village, lanterns bobbing along the dark road, Gerard and Marianne walked together up the same drive where they had first met, the gravel cool beneath their feet, the towers of Renwick Hall rising dark and solid against a clear night sky. No storm this time, only quiet and starlight, and the distant, fading sound of laughter carrying back from the village road. "A year ago tonight," Marianne said softly, "I stood exactly here, soaked to the skin, certain I was about to be trampled by a very startled horse." "A year ago tonight," Gerard said, "I very nearly was persuaded I had imagined the whole encounter, until I found myself unable to stop thinking about the woman who had handed me a key and vanished into a storm without so much as offering her name." "You asked for it," Marianne reminded him. "I simply chose not to answer, that first night. I had spent too long guarding secrets to hand them over so easily, even to a duke."
"And now?"
Gerard asked, stopping at the exact spot, or near enough to it, where his horse had reared and she had stood unmoving in the rain, her hand pressed into his an entire year of change and healing later. "Now," Marianne said, "I find I have very few secrets left worth guarding. My father's name is restored. This house is whole again, and I am standing here with my husband, on the same drive where everything began, with nothing left hidden between us at all." Gerard drew her close, the warm night air settling comfortably around them, so different from the cold, driving rain of that first encounter, and yet the same drive, the same towers, the same quiet, steady woman who had changed the whole shape of his life with nothing more than an old iron key and the courage to wait, patiently, for the right moment to place it in his hands. "Then let us go inside," he said finally, "and let this house rest easy tonight, knowing exactly who it belongs to, and exactly how well it is loved." They walked the rest of the way together, hand in hand, and behind them, Renwick Hall stood fully restored beneath the stars, its windows glowing warm with candlelight, its towers no longer sealed against secrets but open, at last, to whatever quiet, ordinary happiness the years ahead might bring. Inside, the halls were quiet now, the last of the household staff having retired for the night after the long day of preparations and celebration, and Marianne paused for a moment in the entrance hall, looking up at the great staircase where dust had once lain thick upon the banister, where pale squares on the walls had once marked the absence of paintings long since returned to their proper places. She thought of Gerard's first night home, the empty rooms and the cold silence he had described to her since, a house slowly emptied of everything that once made it feel alive, and she thought of how far it had traveled since then, room by room, year by year, back toward the warmth it had once known. "You are wool-gathering again," Gerard said gently, echoing her own words from that morning, and she smiled, and let him lead her up the stairs, past the restored paintings and the freshly polished banister, toward rooms that had stood empty far too long, and now, finally, did not. Tomorrow there would be tenants to thank, accounts to review, the ordinary business of running a great estate that never entirely paused even for celebration. There would be letters from Squire Bellamy regarding some small matter of local governance, and a visit promised from Lord Pemberton, who had, in the year since Colbert's exposure, become rather fonder of Marianne than his early caution had suggested he ever might, admitting once, with gruff embarrassment, that he had been entirely wrong to counsel Gerard toward sending her away. There would be the ordinary rhythm of a household finally set right, wages paid, tenants respected, a chapel that stood open now every Sunday instead of gathering dust behind a locked door. But tonight, there was only this, the quiet halls of a restored home, the sound of their footsteps together on the stairs, and the settled, certain knowledge that whatever had been broken at Renwick, by grief and distance and one man's careful greed, had been mended now, thread by patient thread, by a stranger's key, and a duke's willingness, finally, to come home, and truly see what had been placed in his care.